Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. So my name is Rihanna Kingma, and I'm one of the Communications Advisors at Prince. So today we are joined by Lynda, Carroll, and Lindsay. Before I hand over to them, I'll just go through a few housekeeping bits. So today's webinar is being recorded and will be available later on the resources section of our website. Our workbook was sent out to you earlier in the week, and I have also linked it to a Dropbox in the chat, so you can download it there as well. So I think Lynda and Jim will be going through the workbook during the webinar. So after the webinar, a short survey will pop up. This just gives you a chance to give us a little bit of feedback, suggest other webinars. Yeah, because I know we have definitely ramped them up this year and will continue to do so next year. Lynda and Jim will take questions throughout the webinar, so please feel free to pop them in the Q&A function rather than the chat function, and then we'll go through those throughout. Excellent. Cool. Over to you, Lynda and Jim.
Thanks so much, Rihanna. So, ko Lynda Carroll, tōku ingoa. I am a charter member of the Institute of Directors, have chaired many boards and been a deputy chair on many boards. I enjoy the emotional side of risk, and I love running these seminars and webinars with Jim. So before I hand over to Jim to do a little bit more of the introductions, I would just like to highlight the Chatham House rules, which is in your workbook. And that basically is saying that what is said during the webinar can't be attributed to anybody, and that means Jim and I, and the affiliation between what is said and us. So it's really just so that we can have a sharing of some really interesting stories without fear of it going further and being attributed to us. So Jim, I'll hand over to you.
All right, kia ora everyone. My name is Jim Lindsay. Like Lynda, I'm a chartered member of the Institute of Directors. I chair a couple of boards, worked in the past in public relations, moved into more general management, and now do a lot of work in governance and across a number of different sectors, including government and health and a couple of others. So today what we thought would be really interesting to do is to think about risk. And I know as public relations experts, you work in risk, you think about risk, but we kind of like to think about it slightly differently perhaps, and to talk about very much the emotional side of risk that we think is often underdone and not considered enough. And what we're going to do is we've got about 8 slides, but really we're going to talk about one sort of case study, one example that we can kind of use to illustrate what we're talking about. And what we've done is I've actually picked a topic which is kind of relevant, but quite far back in time, just so that we wouldn't confuse anybody with current work or cross over people's boundaries, because often if you're working just now, you might be working on an area of interest that a number of us might be involved in. So I'm going to take you back. You might be able to tell by my very slight Scottish accent that I'm Scottish, and in Edinburgh in the late 1980s, early 1990s, there was an enormous outbreak of AIDS. And particularly what was interesting was there was an enormous outbreak of AIDS in Edinburgh with heterosexual men. Quite unusual spike in numbers. And what we didn't know was why that was happening. And it was quite a public health issue. So that's what we're going to talk about, is that AIDS things. And I thought it related back to risk and what's happening now. Ashley Bloomfield, as we all know, often has a great public relations line where he says that people are not the problem. The virus.
Sorry, Jim. Sorry, I'll just interrupt you for a minute. Your audio is playing up a little bit again. So maybe you just plug in your headphones.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, hopefully this is a bit better.
Yeah, a lot clearer.
Oh, good.
Excellent.
Sorry about that. So I'll just go back. So Ashley Bloomfield's got a great public relations line he's been using. People are not the problem. The COVID virus is the problem and people are the solution. But when we think about the emotional side of risk, I suggest that actually people are the problem. And often when you're thinking about risk, it's what human factor, what people are doing is the problem. And that's what we have to think about is because people are so emotional and emotions drive behaviors and behaviors drive emotions, and that all affects how we think about risk. So if we think about AIDS, it was highly emotive, it's still highly emotive. It's a disease. In the 1980s, it was huge. It was one of the big things that was taking over the news, particularly affected the homosexual community. And there was a lot of public health about how to try to prevent AIDS and use safer sex methods and just stop that spread of the disease. But we had this big issue in Edinburgh, in the UK, and only in Edinburgh, and that heterosexual men were catching the disease in quite a large number. It was a significant spike. So what was going on? How do you look at this issue when you think of risk? Well, one of the key things you've got to think about is what is happening, and we're going to talk about that a bit later on. But we already had a number of controls when you think about this. So if you have a risk, you think, how do we stop that risk? How do we try to control it, reduce it, minimize it, manage it? So there was a lot of health information going out, but it was focused really on the homosexual community. There was a lot of outreach and activists going out, but they were going to clubs and they were talking to people. So there was a lot of awareness within the homosexual community, and their rates had started to drop. But why was this happening in Edinburgh with the heterosexual population? So that's what we're going to think about and talk about as we get further through. We wanted an emotional topic. It was real. This happened in the 80s, and how we went through the process of trying to look at this risk, manage the emotional sides, and deal with risk management. So what I'll do now is I will pass over to Lynda, and Lynda will take you through what we're going to talk about and then through a little interesting exercise.
There we go. So what we're going to cover off today is we're going to do the risk dance and shuffle. Now, this is going to be fun because it's one of the first times we've run it actually virtually. So the risk dance and shuffle, and then we're going to look at risk analysis and what we actually need to do when we're dealing with risk and how emotions come into the play of looking at risk analysis and risk appetites and managing risk. And then Jim's going to talk about the importance of understanding the people in the room before I finish off by looking at crisis management. And so let's start off by playing the risk shuffle. So the risk dance and shuffle is a way for us to actually start exploring what our risk appetite is. And so what I would like you to do is to grab a piece of paper, and if you did get the workbook, you can print it off and you could be writing on that. And so what we're going to do is we're going to draw a line across the page horizontally. And on the left-hand side, I'd like you to put down the low risk averse. So that's your low risk appetite. And on the right-hand side, make a note of your high risk appetite, as you can see on my screen. Okay. So now we have three areas that we are going to explore, and these are three risk categories, as we might call them in an organisation. But the first one we're going to think about is about our holidays. So when you actually go on holiday, are you somebody who is risk averse? I.e., I had somebody in one of my courses once who has a spreadsheet, and on that spreadsheet they put down half days and evenings, and every half day they pop what they're going to be doing, and they do a link to the museum or to the particular site that they might be going to, and they have their ticket link in there, and basically every half day for their whole holiday is mapped out, including where they're going to stay. And they would probably be classified, I think you'd agree, as having a low risk appetite. So if you're somebody like that, you might put your circle down that end. However, you might be somebody who has a really high risk appetite. And I remember in my younger days when I would grab a backpack, throw it on my back, and travel around and turning up at really remote railway stations in the back blocks of India, getting out and thinking, right, where am I going to stay tonight? That would be a high risk aversion. So take a moment and put a circle on your continuum in terms of whether you sit for holidays around low risk aversion or high risk aversion, risk appetite. Okay. Hopefully you have had no problems doing that. And now we're going to move on and we're going to have a look at money. So money, and how do we actually deal with money? Do we have it in any spare cash, of which we mightn't have many at the moment, but spare cash, do you have it in a term deposit? Earning not a lot of interest, but it's safe there. Do you have it in a bank account? Do you have it under your mattress?
That's the best place, I find.
Oh, you I don't know about that. You see, you could say having it under your mattress means that you have a very low risk appetite. You know it's there, you can pull it out and count it, and it's safe. However, is it as safe as in the bank? So if you have a burglary and they happen to look under your mattress, then you might actually have found that it's all gone. Or do you play the share market like Jim? Do you invest in new startups? Wherever you sit in terms of your risk appetite, put a big fat X. Okay. All right. Now, finally, let's talk about work and jobs. Are you people like Jim and I who actually are quite comfortable not having a permanent role that we get up and go to every day? We actually consult with many different organisations around a myriad of different things, and but we don't have certainty of income. It's about, well, what's the next gig? If that's somebody that you feel that is what you're doing, then you would put your tick over at the risk appetite of high. However, if you're somebody who actually likes economic security, who prefers to be in a job to know that every fortnight you're going to get money in your bank account, then you might say, well, I'm a little less, I'm a little more risk averse. And so you'll put your tick further down to the left-hand side of that continuum. Okay, I'll give you a moment. Righty. So what is this telling us and how does it relate to the emotional side of risk? Well, first up, it's telling us that you cannot just say, I'm a risk-averse person, because I would suggest to you that it is actually quite likely that you do not have your ticks, X's, and circles all in exactly the same place on your continuum. So that says to me that it's important that we think about what risk category we're actually looking at and apply our risk appetite to that category, rather than just having one risk appetite for our entire lives or for our entire entities. So the first thing is to recognize that how we feel about risk determines what our risk appetite is, and that it will vary depending upon the particular risk category that we are operating in. And this is important because it will vary dependent on your entity, and it will vary dependent on the category. So I'm on the New Zealand Army Board. And on the Army Board, for example, our risk appetite around health and safety is low. We actually have quite a low risk appetite because, of course, we have people jumping out of boats, we have people jumping out of planes, we have people working in high risk areas, yeah? So for that, it's low risk appetite. However, if we're thinking about recruitment and getting more people into the army, because we want to grow our armed forces, then we will actually have quite a high risk appetite. We'll want to do innovative and creative things to encourage people to come and see what we're all about and to see how different the Army is today from how it was 50 years ago, how the operating environment within which we operate is quite different. And so we will be quite innovative if we're thinking about how we can actually encourage people to come and explore what the New Zealand Army is about today. So that's an example of how a risk category will be quite different for different, have different risk appetites. The other thing to be aware of is that as a board, we have a number of different individuals, and every single one of us brings our own risk appetites to the table. And yet we can't have a whole number of different risk appetites about a particular risk. So it's really important that we have agreement around the table as to what the organisation's risk appetite is going to be, because that drives, of course, our decision making. It drives how we have our conversations and what we actually are prepared to take a risk on and what we're not. So if we're looking, we have our risk appetites scattered across. And then one of the things that we can use to assist us and gain agreement on what is our risk appetite and what are the strategic risks that we are actually going to apply that risk appetite to is, of course, in our consequence and likelihood of risk. So this is an example of what you might have in terms of a likelihood definition. And you can see here that, you know, you've got a title, and then you've got very clearly what it means and how frequently it might occur. Yeah. And so at a board level, you need to be having those conversations. You really need to be actually having a robust debate and constructive challenge. So similarly for health and safety, the consequence definitions for health and safety are very, very important, and they will change depending on your entity and what you're actually doing in your business. So the fire service, the police, the army, whatever, they may very well have different definitions for their health and safety consequence than somebody who is an office worker at risk of paper cuts and less likely risks. So we want to have an opportunity to really share as a board what our personal risk appetites are, and then to actually have a conversation to land on what the board's risk appetite is. And those conversations, because everybody brings their own liabilities and fear of liability to the table, they will be quite robust and challenging. But it's recognising the whole person and recognising the fact that robust discussions and debates are how we get the best decisions. And the more diversity we have at the board table, the more likely we are to have more of those robust discussions and constructive challenge, and the more likely we are to actually have varying risk appetites. So we haven't got a lot of questions yet, so I'm interested, does anybody have a question they'd like to quickly type in the question and answer box while Jim and I have a brief conversation about how we have applied this and risk appetite in the past. Jim.
So one of the key things is to understand people's history and the emotions that they carry. And I was thinking about PR, and I've worked with a couple of CEs who got burned by media. So they fronted up at some stage, and then they absolutely, it might have been national radio, and you know, they just felt they had a disaster. And that suddenly meant for the organization that they were really media, they were very low risk. If something was in the media, that was a disaster. And how were they going to deal with it? Well, they weren't going to front it up. I've had others who are much, you know, they've been through training, they're confident, and they think, right, if something happens in the media, that's not unexpected. So the likelihood is, you know, it's going to occur. It might happen quite regularly, and they're quite confident if they've got the answers, they've got the material, that they'll be happy to talk to the media, and the risk, in their head is relatively low. And how you judge this is actually being able to know who you're working with, know how they feel. If you're thinking about media as a category, how do they feel about interacting with media? Have they been trained? Are they confident? What do they need to change how they feel about that risk, and how do you work with them? So it's a really interesting thing. Often when you're thinking about risk, the consequences of something happening often don't change, but the likelihood and how you manage the risk can change. And that's what you really need to focus on. So I'll talk about a bit later on how when consequences does change, but that likelihood and how you feel and the emotional impact really affects how you approach a risk and how you manage risk and do a risk management. And if you haven't had that chance to actually talk about it within, Lynda was talking about the board, but it could be within your own management team, it could be between you and board members, is really having some sort of maturity, emotional intelligence around what you're doing.
Excellent, Jim. Thank you for that. I'm wondering whether it would be helpful then to talk about how you actually analyze risk in terms of these things of likelihood and consequence.
Yeah. So, and let's go back to my example of AIDS. Is that the first thing when you think about analyzing risk is you've really got, and we've got a slide up there that kind of goes through, is you've actually got to work out what the risk is, what's happening. And if you've got some data, it's really, really useful. So if you think about AIDS, you think about, well, it's not that easy to catch. Okay, so the likelihood, you can think about some activities makes it more likely to catch AIDS than others. So if you're walking down the street, you're not going to catch AIDS. If you shake somebody's hand, you're not going to catch AIDS. When AIDS first came out, there was a whole lot of drama and emotions. It was lots of people were afraid of it, but actually it's relatively hard to catch AIDS. So you can think, well, so there's the likelihood. It was happening in the homosexual community. So let's put in some controls to try and manage that. So that was education, how to use, barriers like condoms really reduced the likelihood of catching AIDS. So you can understand the consequences if you got AIDS, very serious, a serious disease. So the consequences stays kind of the same. It's a serious disease, but you can change the likelihood, and therefore by using controls, you can change how you're managing the risk. But if we go back to Edinburgh, really interesting. So AIDS, emotional topic. These heterosexual men in Edinburgh were catching it. What was going on? You have to do some analysis. You have to try and work out why the likelihood was suddenly changing. Why were these numbers changing? And we did some research. And whenever you're thinking about risk, that's what you have to do. You have to do some work to work out. You can't say something, if you say something it's going to happen often, the likelihood is high. Why are you saying that? You've got to have some data. You must know stuff. That's why it's going on. So we had these numbers, and we worked out that these men were actually, how they were catching it, they were actually visiting prostitutes. And why we had medical information from these heterosexual men because they were reporting to GPs, they were getting tested. We didn't have much information about prostitutes. They weren't coming to GPs, they weren't part of really they were working under the radar in many ways. We went and interviewed them. And look, this is what we discovered, is that they're all virtually working in prostitution because they're all drug addicts. And they were all drug addicts in Edinburgh. They all were on heroin. Heroin was a drug of choice in Edinburgh in the 1980s. And the way to administer heroin in Edinburgh in the 1980s was by injection. So all the prostitutes were injecting heroin addicts. And that's why they were funding their heroin addiction by prostitution. The police couldn't control the drugs. But what they tried to do was they could control the needles. They confiscated every time they were going around, they were arresting prostitutes. They would take off a little bit of drugs, but they would confiscate the needles. And actually the one thing the police thought they were doing good was they could take the needles away, and that would try and stop them becoming drug addicts. That wasn't happening because the emotional side of human factors, people are driven by their emotions, their desires, what was going to happen. So all these women were actually sitting in a room, there'd be 20 in a room in Edinburgh, in a tenement, with one needle, passing the needle around. So the needle was transferring blood to blood, really easy to get infected. If somebody was infected, all 20 women were infected. And then to fund the habit for the drugs, they were using prostitution, and the men didn't like you wearing condoms, and the women could earn more money if they didn't use condoms. So the police were taking the needles away. There was a financial incentive not to use condoms. AIDS was suddenly spreading. So we had analyzed risk. We knew what was happening. Now, what was interesting is how could we add some controls to do it? And it became really controversial because the real answer was needle exchange, is to provide free needles to heroin addicts. And some people thought that was really bad and that would encourage drug use. And all the health experts actually argued it was a health issue and we should provide them with needles. The drugs issue was a different issue. To prevent the health issues of AIDS, you provide the needles. Now, it's really interesting how emotionally that argument raged around for quite a while about what to do. And you can think about slightly less, but you can think about just now with masks, with COVID, how the advice has changed, how the approach the government has been using with masks is moving. So you can think a controlled mask, how it's changing and how they're trying to apply it in Auckland. You have to wear a mask now from Thursday on public transport, but not in Wellington. So it's really interesting how these controls are put in, and they're all being playing on how do people, they're worrying about the emotional impact of people wearing a mask. Will people do it? Will they rebel? Can we get more people to wear it? Is it a good control? Is it not? So risk and the emotional side of this is really complicated. But if you do that, if you add a new control, you can then measure how likely it is, and that will reduce your risk. So we're adding masks, we're hoping to do that. And what we found in Edinburgh in the 1980s, using the needle exchange, dramatically reduced the number of new women coming into prostitution who were catching AIDS. We then changed our public health to focus more on the heterosexual population and talk about, safer sexual practices to try and reduce, and the numbers reduced right down because we had some controls. So the likelihood changes if you have very good controls. So you have your risk analysis, you think about how likely it is, you think about the consequences, you add new controls, the likelihood will hopefully change. Consequence doesn't change, but because the likelihood has changed, your risk has been managed and has gone down. And interestingly enough, sometimes consequences change. I mentioned that earlier. With AIDS, it's still a very serious disease, but now there's so much more and better treatments and protocols around AIDS. It's not the death sentence it once was. So in some ways you could argue, the consequence of catching AIDS has changed. And if we think about COVID just now, if we have a vaccine and we get better treatments and we're learning how to treat better, then although if we might be able to, the consequences of catching COVID might change in 3 or 4 years' time. We might be able to say it becomes less, the consequences become less because we've got better controls and the likelihood becomes less because we've got more people vaccinated. So we can see how risk changes, but all of these things are based around analysis, science, but also thinking about the emotions. What's driving people's behaviors? Why do people act in some ways and act in others? And if you don't understand the emotional side and you have conversations and think about it, you're going to miss a big part of risk analysis.
Thank you, Jim. I think the other thing that you've really highlighted in that section is talking about the data analysis and gathering the data and doing the research. Because I know that it's very easy to run these risk analysis workshops where you get a whole cross-section of key stakeholders in the room and go through a process to actually throw up all of the potential risks that you might actually find, and whether you're on a steering group, a governance group, or whether you're actually on a board looking at strategic risk. The critical thing, isn't it, Jim, is actually getting some really sound data and research. So you've got that objective side of risk, which is the data and research, but also not forgetting that inevitably we play an extraordinary part in that as humans, and our emotions play a key part in it.
Yeah, and you can see that this slide with the table. I mean, this is kind of like a typical table. If you do risk tables, they'll have colors in them as well, and the head, the yellow, green, and all really illustrating, that people are trying to create some analysis, but sometimes the analysis is really light and they haven't actually got some data. You've got to actually go in there and look at the data and find out what is going on. An example now would be privacy breaches. So how often has your organization had a privacy breach? Consequences have suddenly changed. From the 1st of December, we've got new privacy laws in New Zealand. So, consequences this time is going, you could say, is going up because now you're going to have mandatory reporting. But how likely are you going to have, is it for you to have a privacy breach? Well, you go back and you have a look and you say, well, in the last week, we had 4. Oh, in the last year, we've had 1. In the last 2 years, we've had none. Okay, from the data, you can, there's lag data and there's lead data, but you can look at the data and say, right, well, here's realistically, what the likelihood is. So what controls then do we have in place? Well, we don't allow attachments to automatically go out on an email. Okay, so you've got a control. Do they, have you put a new control in? Have you done some privacy training? How is that going to affect the likelihood? So risk, what's driving people to put attachments on their emails? Are you saying you're not allowed any, but you've got to process 15 claims in your claims office? And if you've got to do 15 claims and you've only got 6 hours to do it, is that driving people to make mistakes and they pick up the wrong attachment, attach it to the wrong person, and you've got a privacy breach? So, so there's lots of stuff you have to, you get the data and then you look at, okay, then you consider the emotional side. What's driving people to do a privacy breach? What have you put in place that's actually making them make mistakes?
Hey, Jim, we've got a question around the table. So
Yes.
in the table, our second box is around risk categories.
Yes.
And so the question is, can Jim explain the second box in the ladder, risk category? What is this, using the Edinburgh AIDS example?
So and this one, so the risk, this is a health risk. So if we're thinking about, so this is a public health for Edinburgh one. This was a public health risk category. So it's not like it's a data issue risk. It's not a strategic risk that you might have a financial risk category. So this one is really simple in some ways in that you're looking at a public health risk, and it's a segment of the population that has suddenly come up as a new in this, it was a male heterosexual, but really it's public risk, and you could subdivide it to say, well, we had AIDS was looking at public risk, but we were looking much more in the homosexual community, because we thought that was where all the risk really was being contained with AIDS. That was the majority of where the infections were happening and where the devastation of AIDS was happening in that community. And then suddenly this new category came up. So you could subdivide it. Does that make sense to you, Lynda?
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And I think it's also about, if we think about risk category, common risk categories might be around operational risk, might be around financial risk, as you said, Jim, around health and safety.
Might be privacy.
So it's actually merely, like we talked earlier around the categories of holiday, money and job, it's just basically clustering risks together into a particular category that makes sense from the board lens or the steering committee lens. Yeah. So and it means you can apply your appetite to it that is appropriate.
Yeah. So I've got a really good example, and just to remind people about Chatham House rules. But last year there was a number, I'm talking about privacy, there was a number of websites that from government departments that contained information that allowed a leak. And so it was privacy, it was a category, but then State Services Commissioner went out and actually gave a warning to the CEs to say that this was, unacceptable, and everybody needed to have a look at their websites and what was going on. So it was almost like if you were sitting there, you would then have privacy breaches, but particularly let's look at websites. What data was being held on the website that could be possibly discovered or hacked, and so very deliberate strategic risk. It was viewed from from the state sector that this was unacceptable and had to be addressed, and it was a very, very specific go and look and report back to me that you are that there will be no more of these sorts of privacy breaches.
Thanks, Jim. And in terms of finally, maybe about risk analysis is the fact that if we look at why the mitigation and the controls fail, often when you go back and do your analysis about why things haven't worked, it's because we haven't taken enough into account around the emotional side of risk or human behavior. And the one that I'm thinking here is around the MIQ, the facilities where we are housing people, and a lot of work was done to make those facilities incredibly robust and secure. And as you know, the Army plays a significant role in that now. But if you think about it, when they were doing their risk analysis, I wonder whether they actually had that people might actually tie sheets together and use them to abseil down the side of a hotel. And who would actually think that somebody would go to those lengths to actually to leave the facility? And if we don't, if we don't take into account the human emotions and what might be going on for people when we're looking at risk, then we're missing a huge aspect of what contributes to the likelihood of the risk actually taking place.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great example. And in effect, what happened was as MIQs have gone on, that the risk analysis has matured, and that's what you expect. You expect your risk is not often. Some people, oh, we did risk in January, so we don't need to look again at risk till next year, and we'll do it again, and we'll have a look. But actually, things evolve, and you learn more, and as you learn more, you need to adapt and change your controls. One of the really interesting things about MIQs, of course, was it was never quite considered. Some people have issues. A number of the breaks were around alcohol, as that people, had to go, and they felt the need. They had to go and get more alcohol because alcohol was controlled within the hotels because they were worried about people being drunk, but they hadn't really factored in the driving need for some people to get alcohol and what lengths they would go to do that. So it's learning, so it's maturing that thinking around, well, what could drive people to come out of the hotel, and then why have we got them in hotels and not in prison? Very good reason. So thinking about how we look at risk and what controls we need to put in is I mentioned it before, but emotional maturity is something we should all be talking about and thinking about.
Absolutely. So if we then think about that a little bit further, understanding the people in the room, meaning the people around the governance committee or around the board table, is absolutely key, isn't it, Jim?
Yeah, because you've got a lovely picture of President Trump, and sometimes a bit of a caricature, but how does he deal with risk? Would be a very important question if you're presenting up material to him and how I'm wanting, planning how the response, how does he feel about elections, about vote counting, about not stopping the vote or counting the vote, depending on where you are. So understanding drivers really starts to help you say that, well, okay, this is how the organization feels about risk. Therefore, we need to put more controls in to try and really stop this from happening. Or actually, the organization is really laissez-faire about this sort of risk. Therefore, we'll put very little money in controls, because often a control costs money, and costs effort, and costs time. So how is that control going to work? And if you look back at, you put in controls, and then you have to do more risk analysis to see if they've had an effect. And sometimes the controls you have are very hard to know if they're making, a dramatic effect, especially things around, messages. So if you say, you're putting out a health message, how effective is that? How do you know? How can you judge if that's working? Well, you go back to your data and say, but if you've got multiple controls, which ones are making the most effect? How can you try and analyze that? So it becomes really interesting.
And so then if we're thinking about the fact, and I don't know how many of you saw Chris Liddell's interview on Q&A, but it was very interesting to hear how President Trump actually likes to make decisions. And it appears from what Chris Liddell said, who's the Deputy Chief of Staff, that what he likes to do is to get people in the room, experts in the room, and to actually debate with them. Now, I don't know how many of your boards or your committees make decisions in that way, but it would be unusual, I think. So a lot of the time what we do is we actually have papers that come to us. And if the papers are well written and robust, they will include what the impact is in terms of risk. And one of the things that we do on the boards that I'm on is we actually have on the bottom of our board papers what the category is that this paper actually falls under, and what our current risk appetite is in that category, and then whether we have made a decision that we want to move our risk appetite in that category either up or down, so that when you're actually considering your decision making, you're actually considering it within the context of risk, which is really what your role is in terms of a board, is to actually ensure that not only that you set the strategy, but that within the setting of that strategy, you are also considering the potential risks that, that you may find barreling towards you, that you actually need to consider and overcome. So I think that that's a critical aspect that we also need to be aware of. And finally, then talking about crisis management, I think that majority of you no doubt have crisis management plans. So you hopefully have identified what are some of the things that might come up that you actually need to plan for. And I don't know about how well people and how current people actually keep their risk management crisis plans. So the important thing with these is that it's critical that we don't just pop them in the bottom drawer and leave them until the crisis happens. One of the things that in the Army we are very good at is wargaming, or actually taking a scenario and saying, okay, what will this look like? How will we actually respond? And it's critical that you do that. If you have a crisis, if you have a client ring up and say, oh my gosh, we've got Radio New Zealand on the phone, they are wanting to talk to us about this privacy breach, what do we do? That client needs to know that you're available on that phone. If you are actually working in an organisation and there's some sort of privacy breach, then you need to know that you can get hold of your lawyer, or else you've fallen over at the first hurdle. So it's critical that we not only have these crisis management plans, but that we actually use them, review them, confirm them, and that they are fit for purpose. Now, the reason that we do that is because we actually hopefully are doing futuring exercises. We are looking at the different scenarios that may come down the train track towards us, and we are actually doing those in a very structured way, so that we have plans in place that we can actually pull out, implement. We know who to call. We know who is the expert internally in the organisation. They know what is needed. And of course, the fact is that there's an organisation called the Institute for Crisis Management, and they've been around for many years, but they issue a report every year. They're in the US. And in 2019, their report pointed out that only 33% of crises organisations experience are ones that have come out of the blue. 67% have been smouldering in the background for a long time. And so that says, well, we need to be constantly scanning our environment, picking up on these clues, doing our horizon scanning, and actually thinking about what is happening, and are we well enough prepared that we can just press play. And the photo there is from Wimbledon. As I'm sure you are probably aware, Wimbledon was one of the few organisations in the world that had pandemic insurance. And as a result, when Wimbledon didn't take place this year, they only lost 50% of the revenue. The rest was covered by insurance. And so a fabulous outcome for them. But we have to ask, okay, so we know and have been told for many years that pandemics are a likely event coming. But only Wimbledon actually had a strategy, had some insurance to help mitigate that. So interesting. Jim, any final comments or questions that you think we should be exploring?
Well, the only other thing is sometimes you see in risk tables analysis a control being SOPs or standard operating procedures.
Yeah.
That's really if you actually do an audit and you go in and review that, one, nobody knows what's in the standard operating procedures. Often people can't actually find them, and they don't do anything. If you're going to have it, you've got to practice, you've got to run scenarios, and you've got to do it regularly, so that it is more than just a paper document saying, oh yeah, we've got an SOP for this. Because when it does happen, one, you should see it coming and try to have your controls in place to mitigate it. But when they breach the control, then you know what to do, and not just you know what to do, but other people know what to do. So because the other side, again, back to the emotion, what you don't want people to do is flap, get excited, start panicking and shouting, because that doesn't help anyone. It's like on the plane when coming into Wellington, and people start to scream. That doesn't help. It doesn't help me because I'm hanging on. I'm not sure it helps the air hostesses and the air, pilots if they could hear. What you want is yes, they know what they're doing. They practice it. The pilots have practiced. There's controls in place, and if it's too windy, they pull out and they don't land, and we all go back.
Or drive to Palmerston North, and we all have to catch the bus.
North, or go somewhere. Yeah. But because it's practiced, they know the controls, and they've got a well-run, what is going to happen. Yeah. They can see it coming. They know the weather's bad. They can see the perimeters. They're going to try. If it gets beyond that, then they have the B plan.
Yeah. And I think the thing is that if we have actually got sound policies and procedures, then we know that they have good controls built into them. So, for example, around fraud or whatever, then you know that they are there and that you've got that safety net. And so it is for the unusual. It's for the rare event that is coming towards you, that you actually need to have your ducks all lined up in a row.
Yeah, and it's again, when anything happens, it's being, if you're consumed by emotion, it's very hard to think. So, and it's very hard to be calm and considered and like, okay, here's a really good solution. Have we checked this out? Have we got the right experts in the room? Have we got all the information? Oh yes, now we understand what's happened. We know what we're doing. We can respond. Yeah. I think risk is one of the best subjects to talk about and to work in. If you're in public relations, you must like it too, because you're dealing with all sorts of interesting things that happen, and you're dealing with people. And that's what makes life interesting, is when you deal with people, I think. Yeah. And you've just got to make sure that you keep that emotional side of risk in your head and thinking and talking about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose finally, it's actually being clear on where accountabilities lie, whether it's in your crisis management plan, whether it's around the board table, whether it's with the Audit and Risk Committee. It's actually being very clear that you know who's accountable for what when you're applying these things. Yeah.
Brilliant.
That's us then.
Excellent. Thanks very much, everybody, for listening, and I hope you got something out of it.
Definitely, it was very interesting. Thank you both. And I know, I think you've given everyone a lot to think about, especially after this year, right? And all of the curveballs that 2020 has thrown us. Excellent. Thank you so much, both of you.
My pleasure.
Cool.
Lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you.